In May 1718, a London lawyer walked into the patent office and filed one of the strangest legal documents in human history. Patent number 418. On paper, it described a weapon, a tripod-mounted gun that could fire 9 rounds a minute at a time when the best-trained soldier on Earth could manage 3. But that's not the strange part. The strange part is written right there in the official text, in plain legal English. This gun was designed to fire round bullets against Christians and square bullets against Muslim Turks. Not as a metaphor, not as a joke, as a patented technical specification. The square bullet, the document explained, caused a more ragged, more devastating wound, and its purpose was to convince the Turks of the benefits of Christian civilization. Read that again. The world's first machine gun didn't just choose its targets. It chose the shape of its ammunition based on the religion of the man it was about to kill. This is the story of the Puckle Gun, and if you think the religious bullets are the craziest thing about it, wait until you hear what actually happened to them. Let's start with the machine itself, because underneath the madness of that patent sits a piece of engineering that was, by any honest measure, roughly a century and a half ahead of its time. The gun James Puckle called the Defense stood on a heavy iron tripod, like a telescope built for war. A single long barrel, around 32 millimeters across the bore, closer to a small cannon than a musket. And behind that barrel, the part that changes everything, a thick, removable cylinder drilled with anywhere from 6 to 11 chambers, each one preloaded with powder and shot. A hand crank at the rear. Turn the crank, and the cylinder rotates, locking a fresh chamber against the barrel. Fire. Crank again. Fire again. If that mechanism sounds familiar, it should. You're looking at the ancestor of the revolver, nearly a century before Samuel Colt was even born. And when one cylinder ran dry, the crew didn't stop to reload it. They pulled it off and slapped on a fresh one. A detachable, preloaded magazine in 1718. To understand how alien this was, picture the battlefield it was born into. Warfare in the early 18th century ran on the flintlock musket, a weapon so slow that entire military systems were built around its slowness. Soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder in long lines, because only massed volleys could compensate for the fact that each man needed 20 seconds of ritual. Bite the cartridge, pour the powder, ram the ball, prime the pan, just to fire once. Rate of fire wasn't a property of the weapon. It was a property of the soldier, his training, his nerve, his fingers not shaking under fire. James Puckle looked at that entire world and asked a question nobody had thought to ask. What if the counting belonged to the machine? Now the obvious question. Who designed something like this? A master gunsmith? A military engineer? An artillery officer with 20 years of powder burns on his hands? No. James Puckle was a notary, a lawyer, a man whose professional life consisted of contracts, deeds, and paperwork, and whose passion project before the gun was writing moral pamphlets against atheism and gambling. He had no workshop pedigree, no military career, no gunsmith's apprenticeship. What he had was an obsessive legal mind, a talent for persuasion, and a country that was genuinely terrified. Because here's the context that patent was written in WEF, and it matters. Europe had spent decades watching the Ottoman Empire push into its heart. Vienna had been under Turkish siege within living memory. Through the 1710s, the Ottoman fleet was fighting European powers in the Mediterranean and in London coffee houses. The Turk wasn't an abstraction. He was the monster in the newspapers, the invasion scenario, the fear you could sell. Puckle, the pamphleteer, understood exactly what fear was worth. His patent didn't just describe a mechanism. It told a story, a defensive weapon, the Defense, built to pour fire into pirates, privateers, and above all, the armies of Islam. with ammunition tailored chamber by chamber to the enemy's faith. So picture it. A lawyer with no engineering background files a patent for a crank-operated, cylinder-fed, rapid-fire gun that won't be technically feasible as a military system until the age of the Gatling, and wraps it in the most inflammatory religious clause ever written into a firearms document. And then he did something even bolder than filing the patent. He built it. Not a sketch, not a scale model, a full working gun in iron and steel. And he was about to put it through a public performance so dramatic that London newspapers would write it up in open astonishment. To understand what happened at that demonstration, and why even that wasn't enough, you first need to see what this machine actually did in the half second after a gunner's hand touched the crank. Because inside that mechanism, the genius and the doom were machined into the same piece of steel. Let's take the Puckle Gun apart. Because to understand why this machine stunned everyone who saw it run, you have to understand exactly what happened when that crank turned. Start with the heart of it, the cylinder. A solid block of drilled metal, preloaded, each chamber holding its own charge of black powder and a lead ball behind it. This block sat behind the barrel, mounted on a central spindle so it could rotate. And this is where Puckle's real cleverness lived. Because getting a chamber to line up with a barrel is easy. Getting it to seal is the problem that has haunted every rapid-fire weapon ever built. If hot gas leaks between the chamber and the barrel, you lose power, you lose accuracy, and eventually you lose fingers. Puckle's answer was mechanical, and it was elegant. The rear of the barrel and the mouth of each chamber were cut with matching cone-shaped surfaces. When you cranked the cylinder into position, a screw mechanism on that hand crank didn't just rotate the chamber, it drove it forward, wedging the cone of the chamber tight into the cone of the breech. Metal jammed into metal, sealing the joint by sheer physical pressure. Fire the shot, then reverse the crank. The chamber backs off, unlocks, the cylinder is free to turn, and the next loaded chamber swings into line. Crank forward, seal, fire. Crank back, release, rotate. That was the rhythm. Now the division of labor, because this is the part that makes it a machine and not just a fancy gun. On a musket, one man does everything in a slow, sequential ritual. On the Puckle Gun, the job's split apart. The gunner works the crank and fires. When a cylinder is spent, a second crewman swaps it for a fresh one, while more sit ready, filled in advance, waiting their turn. The firing and loading stopped being the same action. The reload moved off the gun and onto the crew. Sit with that for a second, because it is the entire future of automatic weapons in embryo. The gun no longer waited on a man's training. It waited on the next chamber, and the performance backed it up. A well-drilled musketeer of the era managed 2, maybe 3 shots a minute on a dry parade ground with clean hands and steady nerves. Puckle's machine tripled that from a single position. But raw numbers never sell a weapon. A demonstration does. So in 1722, Puckle set his gun up in public and ran it in the pouring rain. That detail matters more than it sounds. The flintlock's fatal weakness was water. The whole system depended on a spark thrown from flint onto a tiny pan of loose priming powder sitting open to the sky. And wet powder doesn't spark. A rainstorm didn't slow an 18th century army down. It disarmed it. Battles were postponed for weather. And here was Puckle's machine, in a downpour, firing 63 shots in 7 minutes. 63. In conditions that should have reduced it to an expensive iron club. The London press wrote it up. Nobody had ever seen anything pour fire like that from a single spot. There's a texture to that moment worth holding on to. The crank grinding, the crew swapping cylinders in the wet, powder smoke hanging low in the rain. and a crowd of Londoners in soaked coats watching a lawyer's contraption do something that looked less like a gun and more like a message from a century nobody had reached yet. For 7 minutes on that field, the 18th century got a glimpse of the 20th. And if you're the kind of person who watches a 300-year-old machine get taken apart, bolt by bolt, and wants more of exactly that, this is what the channel is built for. And a subscribe genuinely helps these deep dives keep coming. Now back to the gun, because the story is about to turn. Here's what I've been circling. Everything I've just described is real. It was genuinely brilliant, and it still failed completely. Not sold modestly, not served quietly for a decade. Failed. The machine that fired 63 shots in the rain never saw a battlefield, never entered service with any army or navy, and within a few years the entire enterprise had become a joke London told over dinner. So how does a weapon this far ahead of everything around it die? Not from one bad idea. From three flaws stitched so deep into the design that no amount of cranking could pull them out. The first had been sitting in plain sight this whole time, bolted right onto the gun, a component so ordinary that nobody, including Puckle himself, ever thought to question it. The second flaw wasn't in the design at all. It was in the world that was supposed to build it. And the third, the one that truly killed the defense, had nothing to do with whether the gun worked, and everything to do with a question no general or admiral of the age could answer. What is this thing actually for? Every complex machine has a weakest link, the single component that sets the ceiling for everything else. On the Puckle Gun, that component was bolted to the top of the breech, and it was the most ordinary part on the entire weapon. One standard flintlock. The same ignition as any musket in Europe. And once you see the trap it created, you can't unsee it. Here's the trap. The cylinder could rotate. The chambers were preloaded. The crank could seal a fresh charge against the barrel in seconds. But none of that fired the shot. To actually ignite the powder, the gunner had to do what every musketeer did: cock the lock by hand and refill the priming pan with fresh, dry powder for every single shot. 11 chambers didn't mean 11 pulls of a trigger. It meant 11 separate ignition rituals performed on one mechanism. The revolutionary half of the gun was waiting, every single time, on the medieval half. And a flintlock under rapid fire is a temperamental thing. Flints wear down and need reseating. Priming powder spills when you're cranking a heavy cylinder right next to the pan. Sparks misfire. Take the demonstration figure and do the arithmetic. 63 shots across 7 minutes comes out to 9 a minute, achieved by a practiced crew with nobody shooting back. That number was simultaneously the machine's ceiling and the ignition system's floor. Puckle had built a rapid-fire gun around a component that was, by its very nature, incapable of rapid fire. The true machine gun had to wait for the self-contained cartridge, primer, powder, and bullets sealed in one metal case, and that was 140 years away. That was the first flaw. The second one, Puckle couldn't have fixed, even if he'd seen it clearly, because the second flaw was the year 1718 itself. Remember the cone-shaped seal, chamber wedging into breech, metal into metal. For that seal to hold, the mating surfaces on every chamber had to match the barrel almost perfectly. Now, how do you achieve that in an age with no milling machines, no standardized gauges, no precision measurement worth the name? One way only. A craftsman files each chamber by hand, tests it against the breech, files again for every chamber on every cylinder. 18th century gun making was a cottage craft. Even ordinary muskets left the workshop with every part unique and unswappable, fitted by feel. Puckle's design demanded interchangeable precision from a world that hadn't invented interchangeable parts. Gunsmiths who examined the mechanism said it plainly. too intricate to produce in numbers. Each Puckle gun wasn't a product. It was a one-off masterpiece, priced accordingly, and armies don't buy masterpieces. They buy thousands of cheap, identical things. But here's what's brutal. Both of those problems were survivable. Prototypes get refined. Costs come down. What actually killed the Puckle gun was the third flaw. And it wasn't in the gun at all. It was in the question every officer asked on seeing it. What exactly do we do with this? Think about where firepower lived in the 1720s military mind. Infantry meant lines of muskets, mobile, cheap, replaceable. Artillery meant cannon throwing solid iron balls that smashed hulls, walls, and formations at long range. The Puckle gun fell into the dead zone between them, too heavy on its tripod to march with infantry, but firing a ball far too light to do a cannon's job. It couldn't breach a wall. It couldn't sink a ship. It was a superb tool for pouring rapid fire into massed men at close range. And that was a problem no 18th century commander was actually trying to solve. The killing grounds where machine guns would eventually prove themselves, one, trench lines, colonial outposts, fixed positions under mass assault, didn't exist yet as military problems. Puckle proposed uses himself, right in his marketing, mounted on ship's rails to shred boarding parties, guard bridges, hold narrow passes. The Royal Navy, the best-funded military institution on Earth, the customer this defense was practically named for, watched the machine work and never placed an order. No military contract meant Puckle needed private money. So the lawyer did what lawyers do. He incorporated. Shares in the venture were offered to the public, and this was London in the grip of the South Sea Bubble era, a city hurling money at anything with a prospectus. For a moment, the Puckle gun wasn't a weapon at all. It was a stock. And when the orders never came, the stock did what stocks like it do. The company collapsed, and a London newspaper carved its epitaph with one of the most vicious lines in financial history. The Puckle gun, it wrote, had only ever wounded those who held shares in it, a machine designed to defend Christendom, destroyed by the London stock market. 2 years after his rain-soaked triumph, in 1724, James Puckle died, his gun a curiosity, his company a cautionary tale, his patent gathering dust. And that should be the end of the story. Except it isn't. Because before the collapse, someone actually bought Puckle guns. 2 of them. A real customer with real money and a real expedition. One of the richest men in England preparing to sail 3,000 miles across the Atlantic to claim islands he had never laid eyes on. The world's first machine gun was finally going to war. What happened next is the strangest chapter of all, and it's where the square bullets come back. The only man who ever put money down for the Puckle gun was John Montagu, the second Duke of Montagu, and he was exactly the customer a weapon like this deserved. Fabulously rich, famously eccentric, known across London society for elaborate practical jokes and grand schemes that ended badly. In 1722, King George I granted him something absurd: 2 entire Caribbean islands, St. Lucia and St. Vincent, on paper. Islands the French also claimed, and which were, inconveniently, already inhabited. Montagu just had to go and take possession. So he assembled a private colonial expedition, 7 ships by the largest accounts, settlers, supplies, trade goods, everything a new colony needs. And somewhere on his shopping list, between the provisions and the tools, sat an entry no buyer had ever written before: 2 Puckle guns. Not the Royal Navy, not the Board of Ordnance. A duke, outfitting a private venture, became the first and last customer of the world's first machine gun. You can see the logic. It's the exact scenario from Puckle's own sales pitch. A tiny garrison on a hostile shore, outnumbered, defending a fixed position, a beachhead, a stockade, a landing stage. Precisely the job the defense was built for. 1 gun, 1 crew, pouring sustained fire into anyone charging out of the tree line. On paper, St. Lucia in 1722 was the one place on Earth where the Puckle Gun made perfect sense. The two guns were loaded aboard, crossed the Atlantic through storm latitudes and doldrums, the longest journey any weapon of this kind had ever made, and arrived in the Caribbean, greased and crated, ready to write the first page of machine gun combat history. They never fired a shot, not one. The expedition unraveled for its own reasons. The French pressed their claim, the venture bled money, the colony collapsed almost on contact with reality, and Montague's Grand Caribbean project ended in expensive humiliation, with survivors trickling home. Through all of it, the two Puckle guns sat in their crates like unopened gifts. The entire combat career of patent number 418 consists of a round trip across the Atlantic Ocean as cargo. The most advanced firearm on the planet went on a cruise. And that anticlimax sets up the final deception, because it's time to go back to the beginning. Back to the clause that made you click on this video. Round bullets for Christians, square bullets for Turks. The most infamous sentence in the history of firearms patents. Here's the truth. The square bullets were never made. Not for the demonstrations. Not for Montague's guns. Not once. By anyone. Ever. The most notorious ammunition in patent history existed in exactly one place, as ink on paper. And when you look at it through an engineer's eyes instead of a headline writer's, you understand why no gunmaker would touch it. A square bullet is a ballistic catastrophe. The moment it leaves the muzzle, its flat faces and hard corners grab the air unevenly. It tumbles, sheds velocity, and wanders off target like a thrown brick. Whatever extra wounding those edges promised on paper, the projectile bled away in flight before it ever arrived. And inside the gun, it's even worse. How do you seal a square projectile in a round bore? Gas howls past the corners, pressure drops, and the gun's already modest punch collapses further. Every surviving cylinder, every period drawing of the working gun, every modern replica tells the same story. Round chambers, round bores, round shot. The patent did sketch a square-chambered variant, and it went further still, describing chambers loaded with clusters of small shot, so-called grenades, an early buckshot option for sweeping a deck clear. But the square-bore version stayed a drawing. The hardware that actually existed was conventional through and through. So what was that clause really doing in a legal document? Remember who wrote it. Not a gunsmith, a lawyer and pamphleteer, a professional persuader. Filing his patent in the spring of 1718, while Europe's war with the Ottoman Empire was still burning. It would end just weeks later, and London's papers were soaked in fear of the Turk. A patent in that world wasn't just protection. It was a prospectus, the document you showed investors. And Puckle wrote it like one. The square bullet wasn't ballistics, it was branding. A line calculated to make a coffeehouse investor nod along. A weapon so righteous it even punishes the infidel more thoroughly. He was selling shares in Christian civilization. 300 years later, the marketing has outlived the machine. The gun failed, the company died, but that one sentence still detonates on contact. It's in every article, every documentary, every video ever made about the Puckle gun, including this one. James Puckle, the failed arms dealer, accidentally wrote one of the most effective hooks in advertising history, which leaves the real question. The gun never fought, the company never paid, the bullets never existed. By every measure that mattered in 1724, the Puckle gun was a total failure. So why is it in museums? Why do engineers still study the mechanism? Because the Puckle gun lost every battle except one whilst the argument about what a gun could be. And to watch it win that argument, you have to follow the trail of two of history's most successful thieves. Every failed invention leaves a corpse. The Puckle Gun left a blueprint, and for the next century and a half, other men kept quietly robbing the grave. Start with the most famous heist. The core of Puckle's design was a revolving cylinder of preloaded chambers, indexed one by one, behind a single barrel. Now describe Samuel Colt's revolver of 1836, a revolving cylinder of preloaded chambers, indexed one by one behind a single barrel. The architecture is identical. What changed was everything around it. Colt had the percussion cap, a self-contained spark that finally killed the flintlock bottleneck, and he had American machine tools that could drill identical chambers by the thousand. Colt, ever the curator of his own legend, credited his idea to a ship's wheel he'd watched turning as a young sailor, never to a London patent. He didn't need to credit anyone. The record does it for him. The revolver principle was sitting in London's archives, fully described, 118 years before Colt filed his. Then look at the second theft. And this one is almost surgical. 1862, the American Civil War. Richard Gatling patents a rapid-fire gun operated by a hand crank, with the work split between a gunner who turns the handle and crew who feed the ammunition. Sound familiar? But here's what makes Gatling the true heir. Point by point, his gun solved exactly the three flaws that killed the defense. Puckle's single flintlock choked his rate of fire. Gatling fed on metallic cartridges, the sealed all-in-one round Puckle never had. No pan, no flint, no ritual. Puckle's hand-fitted chambers couldn't be mass-produced. Gatling's parts came off industrial machinery, identical and interchangeable, and Puckle's gun had no battlefield to belong to. Gatling's arrived in the middle of one, a war of fortifications and massed infantry assaults that was writing the machine gun's job description in real time. Same concept, same crank, same division of labor, different century. The Gatling gun isn't just similar to the Puckle gun, it is the Puckle Gun, born on time. Even the name is part of the inheritance. When later writers and catalogers describe patent number 418, they reached for a phrase that barely existed yet: machine gun. Puckle's defense is one of the earliest devices in history to wear that label. The words we still use were, in a very real sense, coined to describe his failure. And this isn't just paper lineage. You can stand in front of the thing. At Boughton House, the ancestral estate of the Montague family, the Duke who bought the only two ever sold, Puckle guns survive to this day. The very hardware from the story you've just heard. A working replica stands at Buckler's Hard on the English coast. Original cylinders and period pieces still surface at auction houses, where 300-year-old chambers carry the faint smell of a revolution that didn't happen. Museums don't keep failures. They keep firsts. Somewhere across those 3 centuries, the verdict quietly reversed. The joke that wounded only its shareholders became the recognized starting point of rapid-fire weapons, the first entry in a family tree that runs through Colt and Gatling to Maxim, and from Maxim to every machine gun on Earth. Which brings us to the real lesson buried in that patent, and it has nothing to do with square bullets. The Puckle gun proved that an invention can be correct and still be doomed. The mechanism worked. 63 shots in the rain proved it. The concept was right. 2 centuries of machine guns prove it. What Puckle was missing couldn't be built in any workshop. The cartridge didn't exist. The factory didn't exist. The war didn't exist. He needed an industrial revolution and a new kind of battlefield, and he was more than a century early for both. Ideas don't win by being right. They win by being right on schedule. If this deep dive earned your next half hour, do 2 things. Hit subscribe and tell me in the comments which weapon you want on the bench next, because this channel takes machines apart one legend at a time, and the archive runs deep. James Puckle died believing he had failed. He had it backwards. Every belt-fed gun of the 20th century, every revolver in every holster, is running a corrected draft of his idea. The lawyer who couldn't sell 9 rounds a minute ended up writing the opening sentence of automatic fire. And here's the unsettling part. The Puckle gun is not unique. History is full of machines like it. Weapons so far ahead of schedule they were dismissed as madness. One of them strapped dozens of loaded barrels onto a single carriage and fired them in one rolling ripple, in an age when armored knights still ruled the battlefield. That story is next.